Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of part one of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, James Andrews, the Great Locomotive Chase, and the first Medal of Honor. Now let's get started with our story about the Great Locomotive Chase. At 5 a.m. on April 12, 1862, a Union Army civilian scout by the name of James J. Andrews boarded a passenger train in the town of Marietta, Georgia. Andrews was accompanied by 19 other men, 18 especially recruited from 3 Ohio infantry regiments. The 19th, William Campbell, was a civilian friend of some of the Ohio infantrymen. The intent of this group was to seize control of the General, the locomotive hauling the train, as well as several boxcars, and to proceed to Chattanooga, Tennessee, approximately 100 miles away. En route, the saboteurs were intent on destroying railroad tracks, burning bridges, severing telegraph lines, and inflicting general mayhem upon an already strained Confederate railway system, a key component of military activity during the Civil War. Purchasing tickets, the men blended in as passengers and remained on board while other civilians and the train crew got off to eat breakfast at a nearby hotel in the town of Big Shanty. The concept of a dining car not yet viable in most mid-19th century rail transportation. When the train emptied out, the Union contingent quickly decoupled the locomotive and 3 freight boxcars from the rest of the train. Andrews and 2 other men who were experienced train engineers then entered the locomotive, while the rest of the men situated themselves throughout the now captive boxcars. They quickly fired up the locomotive engine and began heading north as quickly as possible. Although stunned to observe the train leaving without them, the legitimate engineer, Jeff Kane, and 2 of his crew members ran on foot in pursuit of the General, and their dogged efforts precipitated one of the most remarkable incidents in the Civil War. The federal government considered the efforts of Andrews and his raiders so courageous that in March of 1863, after 6 of these men were successfully swapped in a prisoner exchange, they were personally presented with the first Medals of Honor ever awarded by the U.S. government. Some of the other members of this historic raid, including Andrews himself, were not so fortunate. In June of 1862, after being captured in civilian clothes behind enemy lines, they were convicted as spies and hanged in central Atlanta. Nothing in James J. Andrews' early life indicated eventual involvement in such a noteworthy event. In fact, not much is even known about the first 30 years of his life, other than that he was born in what is now West Virginia in 1859. He turns up 30 years later in Flemingsburg, Kentucky, securing odd jobs as a house painter and, of all things, a music teacher, but was certainly considered a respectable member of the community and engaged to be married at the outbreak of the Civil War. Underlining his ability to engage successfully in clandestine behavior, Andrews began smuggling quinine and other vital necessities behind Southern lines, the aforementioned drug, a malaria cure and hard to get as a result of the Union blockade. Some accounts ascribe Andrews' motives as a ruse to gain the confidence of contacts behind enemy lines. Others maintain that his motives were purely financial. After the Andrews raid, several Union military figures tried to diminish his value as an intelligence agent, but Tennessee Regional Union Commander Don Carlos Buell did agree to allow Andrews and 8 men to attempt to commandeer a Confederate locomotive from an Atlanta location. This failed when an allegedly disloyal local engineer backed out of the scheme. All 8 operatives made it back to Union territory, evading capture, but tellingly refused to participate when Andrews was recruiting participants for a second attempt in April. One soldier remarked later that he felt as if a noose was around his neck for the entirety of the time spent behind Confederate lines. When Carlos Buell was transferred to southwestern Tennessee to reinforce General Grant's army on the Tennessee River, Andrews then approached the subsequent senior Union officer in the region, Major Ormsby Mitchell, with another more daring plan to seize a locomotive and wreak havoc in conjunction with a Mitchell attack on Chattanooga. If Andrews could sever any rail connection with northern Georgia, Mitchell would not have to deal with any regional reinforcement via railroad. There were 17 rail bridges between Atlanta and Chattanooga, numerous telegraph lines, and hundreds of miles of railroad track. Andrews proposed to destroy all of it, leaving the Confederate Chattanooga garrison practically helpless. Mitchell figured that he had little to lose and a lot to gain if Andrews succeeded. If the effort failed, it was merely the lives of 24 men at most. Acting in character as a man that operated more out of financial opportunity as opposed to altruism, Andrews also was to be paid handsomely if the effort succeeded, the amount historically disputed, but at least $20,000, and as much as $50,000 in gold. An agreement to continue to subsequently trade across enemy lines without interference was also allegedly part of the bargain, again underlining Andrews' mercenary mentality. Recruiting the individuals necessary was actually relatively easy. Most of the Ohio regiments had done little more than train and drill since the inception of the war and were eager to participate in something substantive, despite the actual details of the mission remaining a secret. Andrews, based on his previous experience, also was careful to recruit 2 engineers, as well as individuals with a mechanical background. One of the first tasks for the volunteers to complete was the acquisition of civilian clothes, as they were intending to blend in behind Confederate lines. Afforded a modest amount of money from their commanders, the group, 24 in all, completed this task and then assembled near the town of Shelbyville, Tennessee on April 7, 1862. Andrews, 33, was 6 feet, 190 pounds, with a beard and long hair, and a penetrating gaze that made a positive impression on all of them. It was here that Andrews first explained their mission, the danger involved, and specific instructions to take 3 days to get to Marietta, Georgia. He also offered any man the opportunity to quit on the spot if they did not wish to continue. Nobody took him up on the offer. He also explained that if any man was questioned too closely and felt jeopardized, that they could claim to be residents of Fleming County, Kentucky, and intent on joining a Confederate regiment. Andrews was from this county and assured the group that there was no one currently in any Confederate unit from this part of the country with the ability to challenge such an identity. If necessary, any participant should agree to enlist and then desert at the earliest opportunity. It was 200 miles from Shelbyville to Marietta via Chattanooga. Andrews had given the group approximately 4 days to reach this destination. The first 80 miles were to be traversed on foot or any other means obtainable. As the group separated in the woods of Shelbyville in 2s and 3s, a pronounced rainstorm began to pour down, weather that continued in similar fashion for the next 10 days. The first part of the journey would also be the most challenging, the raiders having to make their way through Union outposts without discussing their purpose and then penetrate the Confederate lines, manned by infantry and local militia, as well as any number of civilians who might be suspicious of non-locals. Fortunately, such stragglers, refugees, and actual volunteers intent on joining some specific unit in a distant state were fairly commonplace during this time period. Despite such positive confusion, two soldiers only made it about 20 miles to the town of Jasper, Tennessee, before Confederate sentries confronted them, and upon hearing their tale of intended enlistment, were still suspicious. Who would be walking all the way to Marietta, Georgia, in such inclement weather without so much as a knapsack or any other baggage? They were given the option of arrest or enlistment on the spot. They took the latter and soon found themselves assigned to the defending Confederate garrison at Chattanooga. Preparing for Andrews' raid, Mitchell seized the city of Huntsville, Alabama, on the morning of April 11th after a 40-hour, 40-mile march. Without firing a shot, he captured the third largest town in Alabama, several dozen Confederate soldiers who were in transit, railroad equipment, including locomotives, and large stores of cotton. The residents were totally taken by surprise, having no idea that such a Union contingent would venture so far south. At the same time, Andrews and his men were approaching Chattanooga, where they intended to catch a train that would take them all the way to Marietta, this part of their mission, the easiest part of the journey. By now, despite their ragtag appearance, they were so far behind enemy lines that even the most observant rebel sympathizer would not suspect them. Despite the chaos and panic that ensued with the fall of Huntsville, the raiders were able to secure tickets, and with no identification system put in place by the local government or military, they boarded the 5 p.m. train without a problem. Darkness quickly descended as the train made its way south, first across the Georgia border and then to a dinner stop 38 miles from Chattanooga. It was slightly before midnight when the raiders reached the town of Big Shanty, the site where they intended to steal the train. Although Andrews mentioned that this station had no telegraph, the saboteurs must have been concerned by the numerous tents and dozens of Confederate soldiers encamped in the vicinity. They did not have much time to reflect. The next stop was Marietta. At midnight, the group got off the train with only a few hours to get some rest until getting up for the 5 a.m. train back to Chattanooga. They were fortunate in that the two hotels situated near the train depot were the Marietta Hotel and the Fletcher House, both owned by former Northerners. The Marietta Hotel, in fact, built and run by Henry G. Cole, a New Yorker, not only an unabashed Union sympathizer, but a major figure in the network of Union spies crisscrossing the state of Georgia. He also was extremely knowledgeable about the Georgia railroad system and the bridges along the western and Atlantic route that Andrews and his raiders would traverse. It was probably not a coincidence that Marietta was chosen as the starting point for the operation, giving Andrews the ability to confer with Cole at the outset. Dix Fletcher was the owner of the Fletcher House and a native of Massachusetts. One of the key aspects of the raid was how early the raiders needed to get out of bed to prepare for the morning train, which would arrive at 5 a.m. Workers in the hotel made sure that all of the raiders were awakened at least an hour beforehand, with two notable exceptions. Two soldiers, Martin Hawkins and John Porter, had arrived earlier than most of the other raiders and were staying at the Marietta Hotel. Somehow, possibly because of their early arrival, they were not awakened on time and failed to show at the last-minute briefing given by Andrews at the Fletcher House. Additionally, after last-minute instructions from Andrews, the senior officer in the group stepped forward and respectfully stated that he felt the raid should be called off due to both a large Confederate military presence visible at Big Shanty and the erratic train traffic on the Western and Atlantic line as a result of the capture of Huntsville. Andrews responded forcefully but sincerely, stating that anyone who didn't want to go with him was free to leave and make their way to Union lines, but that he was going forward and would either succeed or leave my bones in Dixie. The commander's words certainly resonated with the group. Grimly, they assured him that they were with him, even if they had to make the same sacrifice themselves. Collectively, the raiders then proceeded across the street to the train station, still without any sign of Hawkins and Porter. Within minutes, the train pulled into the station. The locomotive named the General, the tender, 3 boxcars, and 2 passenger cars bringing up the rear. Slowly, with purchased tickets to various points along the route, the men accessed seats in the passenger cars. Andrews, hoping to see his 2 missing participants making their way to the train, was the last to board, but the men failed to appear. The group now down to a total of 20 raiders as the train abruptly left the station. Hawkins and Porter had overslept, but still almost made it, racing to the station in enough time to see the train disappearing down the track, the 2 potential raiders late by only a few minutes. They were now more than 100 miles behind enemy lines, with very little resources and absolutely no idea what to do next. On the train, the conductor, William Fuller, began to make his way through the passenger cars, taking tickets. Later, he would claim to have noticed a large group of men in civilian clothes as opposed to a uniform, but at the time he had no reaction. For their part, many of the raiders were not exactly sure of how events would evolve when they got to Big Shanty. Theoretically, the entire train was to disembark for a breakfast break, and this usually involved a rush for a limited number of restaurant seats. But what if someone remained behind to guard the locomotive, or somehow an alert was passed to nearby troops, over 3,000 strong, in the adjacent encampment? They couldn't possibly win a firefight with that number of soldiers. But the station was a critical location because it had no telegraph, and no alarm about the general seizure could be transmitted up the track. The train made its way around Kennesaw Mountain and slowly chugged toward Big Shanty as daybreak revealed the large Confederate campsite on the left and the Lacey Hotel as it approached on the right. As the train slowed, the conductor yelled, "Big Shanty, 20-minute stop for breakfast." Passengers stood up, hoping to get a jump on the rest of the travelers, eager to eat something. The raiders watched as Andrews got up, the engineer also rising to make their way to the exit. They were one of the last 2 individuals to disembark, but instead of heading right towards the hotel, they went left, the rest of the group remaining in their seats. Andrews, with Knight slightly behind them, methodically headed towards the locomotive. When he got there, he determined that it was empty, the crew having abandoned it for their meal. He immediately told Knight to head to the gap between the 3rd boxcar and the baggage car and uncouple the train, separating both the baggage car and the passenger cars from the front of the train. Nonchalantly, Knight made his way to that spot and did what he was told, a sentry only 10 feet away, but completely oblivious. While he was gone, Andrews looked up the track to make sure there were no nearby impediments, and satisfied, then returned to the passenger cars, telling the other 18 men that it was time to go. With that, the rest of the raiders disembarked on the left-hand side of the train and made their way to the last boxcar, quickly clambered in full view of all of the Confederate sentries, who remained completely docile and did not even verbally challenge this unusual behavior. With everyone in place, Andrews in the cab then gave the signal to his engineer Knight to proceed. The locomotive shuddered and then slowly began to move away from the station. The conductor, Fuller, and the 3 crew members, Kane, Murphy, and Anderson, had a table with a prominent view of the train, and just about ready to begin their meal, it became clear that an unscheduled departure was underway. What exactly was said and done at this moment is historically in dispute, but it is clear that the crew members all reacted quickly. Murphy later claimed that when he saw the train moving away down the track, he yelled, "Someone is moving off with your train." First the crew and then some passengers quickly headed out of the dining room in the direction of the track, noting immediately that the passenger cars had been detached from the front part of the train, including the locomotive. Fuller immediately confronted the sentries in the vicinity, but they could offer little more than a description of the tall man with a long beard who had accessed the locomotive. Based on the ragtag dress of the unusual contingent of male civilians, that Fuller observed boarding in Marietta, he presumed that the train was hijacked by deserters from Camp McDonald, the warning about such fugitives already disseminated by the local military hierarchy. On the fly, Fuller and Murphy decided that they were obligated to try and catch up to the train by whatever means possible, in this case their own shoe leather. They presumed that the supposed deserters had no idea how to operate the locomotive, but would only get as far as the current buildup of steam allowed, a minimal amount of distance. Fuller did get a prominent local, Lemuel Kendrick, to get on his horse and gallop as quickly as possible to Marietta, a stop with a telegraph wire. There the news of the runaway locomotive could be sent far and wide. With no other alternative, Fuller literally began running down the track as fast as he could. Murphy and Kane also joined, although their age and condition did not allow them to keep up. Anderson stayed put. The reason why has never been historically verified. Although the situation was critical to the railroad employees, the bemused crowd was not as invested, some laughing openly and even jeering, "Get a horse," as the trio sprinted north. On the train, the communal feeling was one of elation. Andrews repeatedly told the men that the most difficult part of the operation was safely reaching Marietta and actually seizing the train. Once rolling northward, the destruction of railway and telegraph wire would prevent pursuit and even knowledge of the heist itself. But this feeling was reduced to dread when still in the vicinity of Big Shanty, the locomotive ground to a sudden halt. Knight quickly figured out the problem. A damper or door to the firebox, which created steam, was left open, most likely by the actual crew member, as a precaution at Big Shanty. Knight closed it, the fire quickly building back up, and to the relief of the raiders, the train was soon humming down the track again. 2.5 miles out of Big Shanty, the train arrived at a freight platform where some railway workers were working on some rail siding. With strength in numbers, Andrews figured to stop briefly and borrow some tools. The most important piece of equipment acquired was a crowbar. Although the foreman in charge was confused, especially because the train was way ahead of schedule, they did nothing proactive and resumed their work upon the general starting up again in a northerly direction. A few hundred yards away, Andrews called a halt again, this time to check the exterior of the engine and cut the telegraph wires that paralleled the train tracks. For the entire ride, this task was assigned to Sergeant John Scott, who proved adept at climbing up the 20-foot poles and severing the wires, eventually devising an even more destructive method of cutting the wire and attaching it to the back of the rear boxcar, so when the train continued, it literally ripped the wire completely off of the poles. Although most of the raiders were anxious about Andrews' very deliberate approach, and even the engineer tried to go as fast as possible, the commander admonished him to slow down. He was intent on sticking closely to the train's appropriate schedule, knowing that otherwise they might encounter a logjam of southbound trains on the one-track line, rail sidings at selected stations the only means of circumventing any train that got in the way. The train did pass through several small hamlet depots without incident, but at the larger town of Allatoona, the locals eyed the passing train suspiciously, and a small engine on a siding prompted Andrews to stop once again. He wanted once and for all to make sure that no train could chase him down, at least from up to this point, and he ordered the removal of a significant section of rail. With great difficulty, no proper tools, only the crowbar, some railroad ties, and brute strength, some of the raiders succeeded in ripping out an appropriate length of steel rail. The next landmark, about 5 miles north, was the Etowah River and a massive bridge over 600 feet long that would get them over this significant waterway. But Andrews' enthusiasm faded for the first time when the general reached a siding on the other side of the river that led to the Etowah Manufacturing and Mining Company. The siding branched off for about 5 miles that led to an ironworks that produced iron, nails, tools, and lately weapons for the Confederate military. The ironworks also owned a locomotive used to haul material and goods to the main rail line. While not state-of-the-art, this locomotive, called the Yonah, was certainly capable of giving chase if it was conscripted by any pursuing elements. When his conductor suggested stopping and destroying the Yonah and sabotaging the bridge, Andrews declined, reasoning that such a blatant confrontation with anyone in the vicinity would undermine the stealth and surprise enjoyed thus far. He told his conductor to press on. About 20 miles behind them, Fuller was just about to reach the small freight depot north of Big Shanty, having run the entire 2-mile distance from the scene of the hijacking. The work gang was still there, quickly informing the conductor of the general's presence about 30 minutes earlier. When Fuller requested a horse, they offered him something even more appropriate, a handcar normally used to transport tools and heavy materials up and down the line. Although it was completely self-propelled, it could get them to Etowah and the Yonah, both Fuller and Murphy knowing about the presence of this locomotive. Once the crew helped load the handcar on the track, the 3 crewmen used their legs to push off on the railroad ties, quickly building momentum on a mostly downhill slope and certainly moving much faster than running. The foreman of the work group and one other worker joined them, initially spelling the winded trio that had run all of the way from Big Shanty. They quickly reached the tiny depot at Ackworth, where they got an update from the residents and borrowed a couple of barely functional shotguns in the event that they caught up with the general. The only delay they encountered was when they hit the patch where rail was missing as the result of the raiders' sabotage. Although this derailed their vehicle and tossed them into the ditch, they quickly had the handcar back in business and moving rapidly towards Etowah, again a steep downhill slope aiding their efforts. Within minutes they crossed the river and presented themselves at the rail spur, and explaining the situation, quickly got the consent of the operator's supervisors to prepare the Yonah to begin a pursuit. They also had the foresight to load up railroad ties, tools, rails, and other materials required to fix any gaps in the line in the event that the raiders ripped up any more of the railway. Amazingly, rather than just giving up, William Fuller had a locomotive filled with armed pursuers and was now on an even playing field in his pursuit of the general. He took command in the cab and told the engineer to head north as quickly as possible. In the general, Andrews was not that far ahead, reaching the village and depot at Cass, Georgia. Again, the crew stopped the train, intent on oiling the engine and reloading the tender with wood from the depot's supply kept there for this purpose. Andrews prepared enough to present an authentic-looking ticket required for that purpose to the local station master, William Russell. Russell acquiesced, but was immediately curious about the train, way ahead of schedule, with no passenger cars and none of the familiar crew. Andrews stepped forward authoritatively, first warning Russell to stand back. The station master's lit tobacco pipe might ignite what Andrews claimed were the 3 boxcars filled with gunpowder and ammunition. He then went on to explain that no less than General Beauregard himself had ordered this emergency shipment to reinforce Confederate troops at Corinth, where Beauregard's force had fallen back after the recent epic battle at Shiloh. Russell, in his current position, routinely received military updates from trains moving up and down the lines, and would have been aware of Beauregard's need of resupply. Andrews was so convincing that he even got Russell to give him the station master's own schedule tacked to a wall in the depot. Russell greatly excited to help the war effort. Andrews' performance greatly encouraged the raiders. The next obstacle, a much larger station 7 miles ahead at Kingston, where they would have to interact with other trains and even wait for a southbound train to pass by in the other direction. Initially, everything went smoothly at Kingston. Andrews ran through the bogus cover story again, convincing the station agent, Uriah Stevens, to give him the keys to the depot's railroad sidings, and the general was then properly backed off of the main track in anticipation of the scheduled passing of a southbound freight. But Andrews was also presented with a telegram that detailed the freight train's delay, instructing Fuller, the anticipated conductor of the general, to wait. 16 of the raiders were hiding in one of the boxcars and had no way of knowing what this delay was for, and with each passing minute, their and Andrews' unease escalated. A local passenger train, the William R. Smith from Rome, Georgia, had already arrived and occupied another siding. Normally, it would wait for the general, take any passengers and mail destined for Rome, and head in that direction. But its engineer would now also wait, as Andrews explained that the normally scheduled passenger train was following behind him. It was 30 minutes before a freight train arrived, but its last car had a red flag attached, a sign cautioning any trains in the area that there was rail congestion ahead and to proceed with caution. Andrews was able to get the conductor of this train to move it to a siding, but he also received the unwelcome news that Mitchell was aggressively headed towards Chattanooga via the Memphis and Charleston line, prompting the Western and Atlantic line to run extra freight trains to get any locomotives and rail cars out of harm's way. The conductor also added that Mitchell's progress along the Memphis and Charleston would prevent any relief to get to Beauregard, an especially ominous statement that would blow up Andrews' cover story. But Andrews reassured the conductor that Mitchell would not be that aggressive, but even if he was, Beauregard would surely push him back. By the time another freight pulled into Kingston, a suspense-filled hour had passed. This freight also had a red flag attached, meaning another freight was following behind. The general still had to wait, but this time it was only a matter of minutes before the third freight arrived, accommodating Andrews' request to move beyond the depot on the main track so that the general could continue on its alleged emergency relief mission. When the local switchman refused to turn over the switch keys to Andrews, more put off by what he thought was arrogance than anything else, Andrews brushed him aside and forcibly took the keys off of the station house's wall, which only further enraged the stubborn local, who angrily yelled that he would report the commander to the local police, etc. Andrews ignored him, even kept his keys, and after a 65-minute delay, the general began to move again. On top of everything else, the cloudy skies finally opened up with a heavy rain. Unbeknownst to Andrews, he had come a lot closer to disaster at Kingston than he realized, moving down the track at practically breakneck speed and as fast as the Yonah could mechanically operate. William Fuller pulled into the Kingston depot within minutes of Andrews departing. Some accounts put the time difference at 4 minutes. Other accounts, like that of Wiley Harbin, the engineer of the William R. Smith, put this gap at 45 minutes. Nevertheless, Fuller was confronted by a confused snarl of trains and a group of train crews on the platform attempting to sort out the mess left in Andrews' wake. Seeing the main track blocked by at least one set of railroad cars, Fuller jumped out of the Yonah's cab and hurried to the Kingston depot, excitedly explaining the facts of the situation and determining that the William R. Smith had the clearest and fastest position to pursue and catch the general. A local militia, drilling in some nearby fields, was also notified of the situation. They quickly arrived and clambered on board the William R. Smith's baggage car, over 30 fully armed men also preparing to join the chase. Wiley Harbin immediately agreed to help, and in his haste to get the train underway, accompanied by Fuller and Wright, they almost left, perhaps intentionally, Murphy behind. He did manage to scramble onto the moving locomotive as it pulled out of the siding and onto the main track, angry that he was almost excluded. He also noticed that with the militia on board and the relative smaller size of the locomotive, they would be hard-pressed to keep up with the more powerful general. Upon leaving Kingston, Andrews must have sensed that he might be running out of time. He told his engineer to go as fast as possible, stopping only to cut some more telegraph wire. Knowing that it was probably likely that one of the Kingston trains might be employed to chase after him, he again stopped about 6 miles north of Kingston. There, his men quickly began the difficult process of destroying a section of the track. 8 men set about this task deliberately, hampered again by their lack of tools. The track had obstinately placed set of ties, spikes, and steel that defied easy removal. The mood of this crew became frantic when they faintly but very clearly heard the steam whistle of a train from the direction of Kingston. With all of their might, the men bent a part of the rail until it snapped, and quickly everyone reboarded the general. Organized pursuit from the south prevented, at least for the moment. The hijacked train then quickly made it to Adairsville, another long freight train on a siding. Andrews again sweet-talked the conductor and crew, recounting his tale of resupply urgency. The conductor even agreed to move his train and 21 cars further down the main track so that the general could continue north. Warned of a passenger train that was already 30 minutes late, Andrews said he couldn't wait but agreed to proceed slowly and post a signalman in front of every curve. He had no such intention of following such a procedure, and out of sight of the Adairsville depot, he instructed his engineer to move as quickly as possible, understanding that the freight train he had just passed, called the Texas, would quickly reach the gap in the tracks only 4 miles south of Adairsville. Ordering dangerous breakneck speed, Andrews even ordering that oil be thrown on the burning wood in the firebox to make the train go even faster. They needed to reach the next stop at Calhoun before the passenger train left, and they almost didn't make it. The passenger train slowly heading south out of the station just as they arrived. The general's breakneck speed was perceived as reckless by the conductor of the passenger train, pulled by the locomotive the Catoosa, and he initially refused to head south enough to let the general pass via a siding, not impressed by Andrews' explanation. It was not until Andrews assumed the manner of a superior officer and firmly ordered the conductor to comply that this conductor, Frank Watts, complied. Once again, Andrews prevailed, and again the train quickly began heading north. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this podcast about James Andrews and the Great Locomotive Chase. Information for this podcast came from the book Stealing the General by Russell Bonds. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige, and please tell a friend about Bite-Size Biographies.